Hi, welcome to our conversation ongoing about what's working to engage young people. My name is Hannah Evans. I'm a researcher at Springtide. With me is Reverend Larry Morris, who is the director of Inclusive Collective based out of Chicago. Hi, Larry. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited for our conversation because I both really enjoy and value the work that you guys are doing, but I also love the way that you think about and talk about your work.
Mm.
Um, so I'm really looking forward to learning more about what you do, but also about what your vision and hope are for continuing to learn more about what you do. So,
Mm.
can you just tell us a little bit about Inclusive Collective and what it is and what the mission and values are?
Yes. Again, thanks for having me. So, the Inclusive Collective is a campus ministry in the Chicagoland area. And I'm going to read the manifesto. When I applied for this position, I was like, this manifesto really grabbed me. And it's something that I continue to come back to. And so it says that we are the Inclusive Collective. We are a community. We are artists, intellectuals, realists, weirdos, doubters, believers, students, people. We are a safe place to be our whole selves, unashamed of who we are, what we look like, or who we love. We are shamelessly Christian, and we're reclaiming the genuine love it should mean. We are leaders and activists. We are servants to those in need. We are fighters for true justice, and we exist to fuel young adults through Jesus-rooted soul work. And so that is our manifesto. That is, our purpose is really to fuel young adults through Jesus-rooted soul work. And then our values are we strive to be Jesus rooted, inclusive, communal, authentic, and active.
One of the things that grabs me right away hearing that is that you're both inclusive but also explicitly Christian. And I was curious, what does it look like to be inclusive while also having like core tenets and values of your organization that you hold to?
Yeah. And so I think, there are many different forms of Christianity, right? So there's not one way to be Christian. And I think, sometimes we talk about one or two ways to be Christian. And so, I think we are trying to put out into the world our understanding of Christianity, right? And it may have some fluidity there, but really following the life, the teachings of Jesus Christ. And depending on what lens you read the scriptures through, right? I think Jesus was inclusive, right? And so really trying to follow that and model that with students and in our work as an organization.
So what brought you to Inclusive Collective when you first got started? Because I know you've been there for like a year now, 2 years.
It'll be 2 years in
Okay.
July. Yeah. So yeah. Really, it was that manifesto, and so I was doing a church plant on in Nevada, and this pandemic, and it just really wasn't really moving and going anywhere. But I still felt this call to ministry, this call to service in a non-traditional way that wasn't necessarily in a traditional church. And good old Instagram, I found this position. And like I said, when I read the manifesto, I was like, this is a wonderful way of being in community, right? A wonderful way for particularly college students who are in this time of exploration, this time of learning and growth, and not just academically, but spiritually, their identities, their vocation. And I was just really grabbed by the possibility of sitting with a community with students as they explore who they are, right? And I've never seen spirituality as separate from the rest of our lives. But how can this organization create a space for students to explore spirituality while also being grounded in Christianity if they choose to be so, but have this safe and brave space to explore Christianity, spirituality, excuse me, in ways that are authentic to them, but also not just for themselves, like in a community, right? And so when I think about even the early church, right, it was a lot of different kinds of people, right, trying to figure this thing called life out and trying to figure out what does it mean to follow Jesus. And so I was really captivated by the manifesto and the values that the organization has.
So when you say safe space and brave space, what do those what do those mean to you in how you cultivate like inclusivity in the day-to-day lives of young people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I recognize that our spaces are not safe right? For particular people in particular times. And so we do our best to create a space where people can practice vulnerability, right? And so that the space feels safe enough where they can practice vulnerability, right? And be brave in that space. And so I think it's a combination of both. Yeah, I think practicing vulnerability is something that we all can, continue to grow in and learn. But if it's safe enough, if people know that their stories can be held and heard, or at least listened to, then um, they'll share, right? And so we try to do that, within the small groups that we have, and in the worship that we have, we did dinner and worship for a while, and so even a part of that space was this intentionality on inviting students to ask questions, to comment, to give feedback on the sermon, right? So it wasn't just me speaking to them, my thoughts, but it's like, this is what I think, right? This is what I feel like God is saying. What do you think about that? And so there was this safety and this brave kind of space there too, because you can disagree. It's okay. It's fine. But really want to give students the opportunity and the space to do that.
Totally. You mentioned a little bit that you work with college students. What do you, I guess, what do you really enjoy about working with young people in college? Because I feel like we talked a lot to people who are doing that like 13 to 17 group, and
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear about what it's been like for you working with 18 to like 23, 24 year olds. Or
Yeah.
I guess I should back up. Like, do you feel like the students you work with are in that very conventional age demographic, or are they more varied than that?
I think it's around maybe 18 to maybe like 26 or something around there, like that age are the students that I've worked with. And again, I think it really is around this space of exploration. And so there are some students, particularly queer students, who have come from traditional churches or even churches that may be progressive, but not progressive enough to hold their gender identity or sexuality, right? And so, like I said, that college years are, a really time of exploration and trying to figure out identity. And so, like, some students have come from these really, really conservative religious spaces, and they stayed connected, but also knew that they didn't fit particularly in that space. And so, having conversations with them and honoring, their stories and what they're feeling and their understandings of God and the divine. And not necessarily showing, but affirming to them that there are other possibilities, right? So that's one of my favorite things about the job, about the work, is sitting with students either individually or in like small groups, and having those conversations, um, and not again just thinking about spirituality as this thing that lives inside us or like inside a church or inside like the meeting space we meet in, but how do we understand spirituality and even vocation as a part of our everyday lives, right? Which I think Jesus modeled that in the scriptures. But how do we create that space to do that? And we don't do it perfectly, right? But we do um, think about faith and spirituality in our studies, in the ways in which we are in relationship with each other in school and all of these spaces. So that has been one of my favorite parts of the work. And I think students have questions, but also insights too, right? So I don't necessarily see my role as like, let me pour all this wisdom and information into you. It's like, no, let's figure out like what have you noticed about life and about God? And maybe there's some guidance there, right? Like these are some other possibilities, but really affirming the experiences of students. And so I would say that I consider myself to be progressive and queer in a way that is not just around sexuality, but like, let's get rid of these binaries. But even talking to students, I'm like, ooh, that's a boundary I didn't know that I still
Mm.
had, right? Let me figure out, kind of what that is. And so I am also challenged by, their insights, and yeah, insights into spirituality, faith, community. So it's been helpful for me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What would you say have been some of the more challenging parts of working with young people in your role?
Yeah, I think the most challenging part, at least for this season, has been the kind of behind the scenes stuff. And so, I came to the organization after the transition. They didn't have an ED for like a semester or so. The COVID pandemic was still going on. And so institutions were still trying to figure out how to navigate that. And so it's just a lot of different kind of transitions going on. And so we did not, we still had a relationship with the school, but not in a formal way. And so we didn't have the opportunity to be on campus in these formal ways, right? And then as the school was trying to figure out what do they do after the pandemic, after COVID, getting um, students back on campus, there was just a lot of chaos, in the best way of trying to figure that part out. And so I think that's been the major challenge so far, not necessarily with the students, but like how do we get in front of students in a way that lets them know that we're available, that our organization is here to create that space. And we had students who are part of the organization like kind of before the pandemic, but they're students. They grow, they transition out, they go on, they graduate school and go on with the rest of their lives. And so that's been the most challenging part, is really rebuilding kind of the foundational things and the structures that allow me to get in front of students. Because I don't want to be on campus like sneaking around and hiding, right? But I really want to be there in a way that's like, hey, we are part of this community, and this is, that the community, the part of the community that we want to add and be a part of is this kind of progressive understanding of Christianity. And so that's been the work. I will say that, after a year and a half, almost 2 years, we have found ways to be back on campus in legit, honest ways. And so looking forward to next semester and really being a part of the life cycle of a campus from the beginning to the end, and really getting in front of students. So that's been the challenging part. Because I know when students find us, they're excited about the organization and about the work, and about the possibility of just being fully human, right? Asking questions and still having um, community and spirituality that is meaningful for them, that doesn't feel like this is a thing you have to believe, right?
One of the things that I think we wrestle a lot with on this project is that, even the phrase like "what's working"
Mm-hmm.
connotates this idea of like we've done it, we're working, like we've arrived, and really, what has stuck out to me doing this project is that what's working is really a process.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something you achieve at the end, but it's really like the journey itself. Like while things are working, there are going to be other things that aren't working like simultaneously. And so you kind of always have to be building toward working. And I think that can be hard for people, but I also think that it's hard to see ourselves as like doing things that are working while we're in that process. And so I was wondering what it looks like for you. This is kind of a two-part question, so I'll ask the first part first. Like, what are some things even while you're in progress, like in that middle of like setting things up to work, that you feel like are already working?
I think one of the things is really just not giving up, right? This perseverance and really continuing to do the work. And so I think that is working for us around being on campus in ways that we can be on campus. So we may not be able to do everything, but we can be on campus in meaningful ways. And so that has allowed us to connect with some students, to connect with students like we did. I offered a Queering Lent series, and we had students show up for that. So that was really affirming. Um, it wasn't as big as I wanted it to be as far as like offering an in-person and online, but people came online, right? Students came online and really said that the process was meaningful for them, right? And so again, holding what's working with like still trying to get in front of additional students and more students. Students do enjoy and find meaning in the work that we offer, and I would say that I hesitant to say we're the only kind of progressive campus ministry, um, in the space, but I think we are one of the few, or at least really, really open about that. And so, um, yeah, just not giving up, like persevering, continuing to do the work has been really, really helpful for us. And I know it sounds really simple, but my experience has been that can be so many things that are going, so much chaos, so many things that are going on that sometimes I felt like, is this worth it, right? Do students need this? Do students want this, right? And so, again, um, trying to relay this foundation with the organization, getting new board members, reconnecting with the school, raising money, right? All of these things are necessary parts of the work for me to be in front of students, to connect with students in a way that supports their development, their growth, their life. And so, as you said, it is kind of both and. And I think a part of the work that I'm doing with the organization now in this season really is relaying this foundation. This the behind the scenes stuff, the admin stuff that has to happen in order to do the work of being with students, and and building this community is as much as part of the work as being with students, right? And so really
Yeah.
balancing both of those has been a part of my work so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, my second question was kind of to ask about like what that
Mhm.
foundation is laying and what it looks like. And while you were sharing that, like one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot as a sociologist is that
Mhm.
the structure of your organization plays a huge role in the quality and type of experience that young people
Mhm.
have.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think when we think about Let's Working, we think a lot about like the personality of the person in charge and the program itself and what they
Mhm.
do. And all of that is true. But I think a lot of that behind the scenes stuff that you're mentioning of like how is our board structured? Where does the money come from?
Mhm.
Has like a trickle down impact on what young people actually experience like in the context of the ministry itself.
Mhm. Mhm.
do you
Yeah.
do you how do you see that foundation like coming to bear on like students' actual experiences like in the work?
Yeah, I love that question. I think that is a really good question. And I agree that a part of the culture of an organization or even the student culture we're trying to create also lives within the organization, right? And so, like, how do we set up the structure, decision making power, and all of that within the organization? And so I will say that the Inclusive Collective has had a history of student involvement, right? That there has been a history of student leadership. And so when I came, again, it's a bit complicated because of COVID, right? Like that really has impacted us. But before COVID, we had student interns, and they played major roles in the organization. So they led small groups, they were on staff. And I think they were trying to figure out like how do we have student voice on the board. So those conversations would happen before I came, and then transitions, blah 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 blah. What I do think is we're trying to figure out what does student leadership look like now. And so before, I feel like students were too involved in the organization, and I say that with grace, right? Because they're students, right? They're students. They are focusing on their education and whatever career or vocation they have, right? And so I think we're negotiating and trying to figure out how can students still participate in the organization in the ways that's meaningful, where they have voice, they have decision making power. But if they leave, the organization doesn't fall apart, or the organization not too invested on the students' leadership. And students don't feel like they have to like stay with the organization, or the organization falls apart, right? So like you're just really just trying to navigate that. And so we do have alumni on the board now, and so to give like an alumni perspective and on the board, and I would love to bring back our internship, but just allow it to look different. So there were paid internships, I should say that, because sometimes internships are unpaid. We don't want to like just give free labor for students, right? We do want to pay students and allow for some space for leadership development. And so we're thinking about what does that look like now and in the future in a way that is set up so that students enter, but they also know they're going to exit, right? There's not this feeling that they're just going to be with the organization forever. And so thinking about that and, really getting students insights, right, on that process, what that looks like. And then the other side is we are a nonprofit, right? And so there are particular rules that we have to abide by, right, with the government and all these kind of things. And so we don't want students to feel like they are too involved in that process, right? If that makes sense. And so it really is like this balance of um, how do we support students' leadership in their spirituality? When I say leadership, I'm including spirituality. When I say spirituality, I also include leadership because I feel like they go together. They're not these two separate things, in a way that really supports like their development, and that they're clear on the responsibility and roles of like staff versus students. And so it's muddy, but we're working through it, so that students do feel like they also have a say in the organization and the kind of what we're doing, where we're going, without, because it's not a student organization, if that makes sense. So I feel like it's just like this kind of
Yeah, yeah.
these boundaries that we're trying to figure out and put in place. But we do exist again to fuel young adults through Jesus Rule the Soul work, which means they have some ownership in it. I'm still trying to figure that out. I keep coming back to this desire to do this internship program again because I do think it is a way to pay students, particularly students who are in school who may need to work. So they may not have additional time to be involved in other activities because they have to work. But if we can build up our internship program again, where they are involved in the organization's work and they're developing leadership and also all of these things and also getting paid for it, I think will help, particularly students who um, are from marginalized communities or underserved communities who, again, like need this additional financial
Yeah.
support. So that's something that we're working towards and thinking about as we. That's a part of the foundation laying. I said all that to say that's a part of what I'm thinking about when
Yeah.
I'm relaying kind of this foundation.
Yeah, all of those decisions make such a big impact on like which young people get involved in the work
Mm-hmm.
that you're doing and
Yeah.
how involved they can be and all of that. Yeah, totally. I loved that you mentioned that you guys did a series called Queering Lent. I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the things that I sometimes struggle with the term inclusivity is that sometimes when people think of inclusive, it's just like, oh, you're welcome to be here. As in, like,
Mm-hmm.
we're not going to be explicitly homophobic or racist, or if you are here, but you're like, that doesn't mean that your experiences are going to be like centered
Mm-hmm.
or focused on in the work that we do. Like, you can be here, we're not going to kick you out, but that doesn't mean that you're going to like this is going to be about you or supporting you in a specific way. And I love that like it's in the name Queering Lent that like it's specifically distinctly like from a queer perspective. And so I was wondering like what it looks like for you the to to be welcoming and also centering and how to balance that for students who might struggle with that. Like do all students love that or do some students have a harder time with that? Like I'm sure there are straight students in your
Yeah.
work in your program. Like
Yeah.
how do they I guess I'm curious how you navigate that.
Yeah. And so I always define queer not just as sexuality. And I think it's also a way of being, right? And so, queer theorists argue
Yeah.
around if queer is just around sexuality. So can can straight people queer, right? This all dialogue. But for me, it really is, yes, LGBTQIA folks, but also people who are committed to not living within binaries, right? Right. To challenging binaries, to being transgressive, to being creative. Like all of these things for me come up when I think about queer. And so in some ways it can be similar to like justice or liberation, right? Because and so I hold all of that, and I say that with students. So even when we did this queering Lent piece, yes, it is around like sexuality, but it's also about how do we see the world and view the world? How do we see scriptures? What questions are we asking around about scriptures and about our experience that get rid of or challenge the binary, right? And so the folks who have been a part of the ministry so far have not really had like really like challenges around like queer, like queering Lent or like this queer space. And I think that is one of the nuances of inclusivity too, right? And so, you know, we are inclusive and open to everyone who wants to be a part of the community. But that also means that to be a part of the community means that you have to have some openness too, right? And so I would be dishonest if I'm saying, oh yeah, so we are open to all genders, sexualities, cultures and races, right? But someone who is anti-black can also be in the space. That's not necessarily true because
Mhm.
the community, the purpose of the community is to be a safe, brave space. And not only myself, but the community will hold folks accountable, right? And so I think around this idea of inclusive, being inclusive means, yes, you can come in this space and be a part of it, but there's also an invitation to transform, right? And so we all
Yeah.
have biases, right? They're just a part of our experience. I think that is different. Like naming your bias and knowing you having it with the intention of wanting to change it, right, is different than having a bias and you have no intention to change. Like you just come into the space to disrupt. We don't invite that, right? We do invite folks who are curious, who want to be a part of community, who may not name that they have a bias, they may not use that language, but they know that they may feel a certain way around particular communities or this curiosity. So yes, you can come be a part of this community, because that is one of the ways in which biases change, like negative biases change, right? When you're involved with folks in a space. And so, um, and again, you named like gender and sexuality. We're also thinking about abilities, neurodiversity, like all of these ways in which we are different, um,
Yeah.
and all of the ways in which I think we experience and we see the divine through these differences, in beautiful and challenging ways, right? And so, like, difference does not mean that it doesn't have any sort of like challenges we have to kind of work through and figure out. But I think that is the beauty of the work. Like, how do we really, honestly, truly create this community that is inclusive of all people, right? Who
Yeah.
want to be a part of this community? That means some of our structures need to change, right? That means that some of the ways in which we work and we do ministry and life together need to change. And that's ongoing. It doesn't just stop. I think our community changes every time someone new comes in, right? There is some sort of, queerness. There is this fluidity that happens, that needs to happen as community members, come and go from the work that we're doing.
How do you think, and this might be a really hard question, and I know we're coming up on time probably soon, but how do you think a structure, like an organization that is focused on queer justice, economic justice, racial justice is different from a different type of, like, an organization structure that doesn't value those things?
That is a great question. That is a hard question. Thank you for that hard question.
I'm I'm sorry, because I'm like, we could have a whole
Yeah.
conversation just about that, but
Yeah. I think that it makes the work, it's challenging and messy. I mean, I think, because it's just challenging and messy in like the best way, right? And so, um, yeah, that is a great question. And I feel like I'm keep coming back to the term queer today for whatever reason, because I do think that it does mean that there's just this kind of transgressive nature to it. And so if we are committed to justice and liberation of all people, um, I think that means that as our organization always has to think about that and look at that, and be challenged if students say, well, I didn't feel included in this particular way, right? And the other part of that is for students who are committed to justice in like this limited way, right? Like they are passionate about queer justice, but they don't understand like there's anti-blackness in the way that they're
yeah.
existing, right? Particularly as a Black ED, right? Um, and it's hard sometimes for students to hear that, right? And to be able to, okay, to name that. And so I think this it's challenging. I don't know another way to say it, right? And the way that
Yeah.
a lot of funding is set up too, like funders sometimes only want to fund like particular parts of ministry, right? Or like particular areas or focuses of liberation. And we are doing our best to have a broad sense of liberation, a broad sense of justice and freedom, right? And so it's challenging. It's challenging work, but I think that is the work that the church should be a part of, right? That is the work that organizations should be a part of, particularly in college ministry, right? Because I always think about if we can create a space for students to engage, no matter what they're studying, to engage differences in sexuality, gender, race, ethnicity, culture, differences around even like spirituality. Like we are Jesus rooted, but if you don't believe in Jesus the way that I believe in Jesus, it doesn't mean that you can't come, right? So all of these differences, if we can create that space for students to engage in this and navigate this, ask questions, be transformed, be changed, then that would carry on with them no matter what work they do, right? So if they're studying medicine, right, then maybe they will see the divine in this person who is completely different than them. Maybe that will impact the way in which they practice medicine, right? For folks who may be doing media work, like, so all of these just different ways in which the hope is this ministry can create space to impact and transform and change students and affirm students too. Like, I don't think that students just come to this not knowing things. Like, I think that even my experience is like, there has to be a different way to follow Christ and Jesus than what I'm experiencing, in these places. And so I think this commitment to answer the question, hopefully, this commitment to all of these ways of being inclusive, will help students and other organizations to also live into a fuller understanding of inclusivity, and to recognize maybe the areas where they're not as inclusive and to put some time and energy there, right? So there are some Black spaces who are inclusive around, you know, Blackness and culture, but still have homophobia there, right? And so, like, how do we celebrate the ways in which organizations are inclusive, and also have this prophetic edge to name, well, these are some ways in which you can grow. And that's true of our organization too. Like, we're not perfect, right? So I don't want to paint that.
Totally.
But I do think it's this commitment towards perfection, right? And so if we say that we are committed to these values, that when people tell us we're not, and right, when we have these spots to say, okay, you didn't really do this well, that we would be open to receive that feedback and to figure out how we can live more fully into who we say we are.
Yeah, one of our themes for this project is adaptability.
Mhm.
And listening to you talk made me think about like adaptability really, in order to work well, is just a constant back and forth conversation, I think. Just like
Mhm.
ongoing dialogue about like what is working, what isn't working, what can we do
Yeah.
differently. And I think like, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this, but my first thought is like the ways that like um queering power structures factors into that is like is sort of thinking differently about like traditional hierarchies of like power and decision making. And it sounds like you guys are really thinking through like what it looks like to navigate like power dynamics like in those relationships and open them up for conversation in order to adapt, which is
Yeah.
the goal, right? Yeah.
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 Well, thank you for sharing. This was a great conversation. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you really want to share about your organization?
No, I think we've covered kind of the main things. Like, again, we are doing our best to be this space of an inclusive space for students, for college students. And again, like, not just thinking about spirituality and even religion or faith as something that is separate and apart from our lives, right? And I think in
Mhm.
some aspects we've seen how people can go to church, but it doesn't reflect how they live, like,
Yeah,
outside of
yeah.
that environment. And I'm like, let's queer that. Let's really
Mm.
reclaim, like the manifesto says, what it means to really love folks. And it's an ongoing process. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that fluidity, like, probably can feel messy to people who want that very, like, compartmentalized way of thinking. But I also think that, like, being able to be in process is inherently messy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's how, like, you move through that into something more complex and, like, richer as a result of that.
Yeah. And the
Yeah.
other thing I'm thinking about now when you say that is, I think that also it's the messiness causes us to think about how we talk about our work different, because it's not like we can say we have like 1,000 students who do this one thing, right? And so, numbers are important. The way we talk about our work is important. And I think it also challenges that too, right? When we talk about like grants and things of that nature, like, how do we talk about and name really the transformation that happens inward if there were
Mhm.
25 students and not 1,000? You know what I'm saying? So, like, the point is, like, it impacts all of
Yeah.
these different things. And so, which makes it exciting and fun work. It's hard work, but it's also exciting and fun, because I think it really is about this creating something that is new. And you would
Mhm.
never get there, as you mentioned earlier. It's always like in process, and hopefully there are these benchmarks so we can name, like, this is something that worked. And there have been, in our conversation we talked about that. And it's like, okay, this is working or has worked. Now let's figure out what this next thing is. So it's a fun adventure.
I feel like that's kind of a great way to like wrap things up. Like what for you would you see as like like for you a benchmark of in the short term of like if we're able to achieve this, like I will feel like this is accomplishing what I want it to accomplish like in my
Mhm.
work.
Yes, I think once we were able to get the internship program back up in a way that really supports and helps students, I think I would feel like, okay, this is a benchmark, right? And so when I think about the internship program, I think about, paid work, but also space for reflection, to think about vocation over a semester, maybe a year. Um, and that it's not like this one thing that you do and then you're done, but it's like, no, let's create space to slow down, to really think intentionally about, our lives. And so if we can do that and it's funded and we can pay students, like I would feel like, okay, my work isn't done, but like this is it, the stuff I've been doing for this last year and a half,
Yeah.
has come in this space. And so I think that is a thing. And thank you for asking that question, because I'm going to write the answer down and remind myself, that
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
what I'm working towards.
Yeah. Where can people find you and also find Inclusive Collective and support the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is our website. It's letsgetinclusiveshy.org. We update that and you can find out information there. And all of our links to social media are on the website. And you can sign up for the newsletter and all that good stuff. Make donations if you want to do that. All of that is on the website.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yes.
This
Thank
was
you.
great.